I recently read an article by another philosopher, very sophisticated philosopher named Quentin Smith, in which he gives two arguments against the existence of God, and one of them is the logical argument from evil. So there are a few people today or recently who have claimed that this is a good argument. But now listen to what Rowe says. Some philosophers have contended that the existence of evil is logically inconsistent with the existence of the theistic God. No one, I think, has succeeded in establishing such an extravagant claim. Now you've got to understand that Professor Rowe of Purdue University is himself an atheist. He says, indeed, granted incompatibilism, that is, granting a certain rich conception of human freedom, there is a fairly compelling argument for the view that the existence of evil is logically consistent with the existence of a theistic God. And then he references the Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga and his work, which has effectively demonstrated the logical compatibility between those three propositions. God is all-powerful, God is morally perfect, and yet evil exists. So what does Rowe say? The jig is up? There is no argument from evil that the atheist could count on against theistic belief? Not quite. He goes on in the same footnote, there remains, however, what we may call the evidential form, as opposed to the logical form of the problem of evil. This is the view that the variety and profusion of evil in our world, although perhaps not logically inconsistent with the existence of the theistic God, provides nevertheless rational support for atheism. In this article, I shall be concerned solely with the evidential form of the problem which I think presents a rather severe difficulty for theism. All right? So as far as this atheist philosopher is concerned, even though he allows that the logical argument from evil fails as an argument for atheism, there is still a potent, persuasive form of the argument from evil that is effective. And that brings us to what he called, and what we'll call, the evidential argument from evil. What is the evidential argument from evil? Remember that an alternative term, name for the logical argument from evil is that it's a deductive argument from evil. An alternative name for the evidential argument from evil is that it is a probabilistic argument from evil. The evidence of evil, according to the evidential argument from evil, does not entail that God does not exist. According to the logical argument from evil, evil entails the non-existence of God. Either God is not all-powerful, or God is not morally perfect, or He's neither one. But according to the evidential problem, evil only makes it very likely that God does not exist. Evil makes it likely that God does not exist. Now, I'll say a little bit more about that particular logical point in a moment, but now I want to clarify something else. The proponent of the logical argument from evil might believe that any evil whatsoever is incompatible with the existence of God. That you could take any evil feature of the world and argue from that against the existence of God. Now, the atheist might not want to do that. He might want to say, well, you know, some evils are compatible with the existence of God, but not all evils. But he could go either way on that. In fact, he'd probably have a better way, he'd probably have more going for him if he argued that any evil is incompatible with the existence of God. Because as soon as you say, well, some evils are and others evils are not, then you've got to say, now what's so special about those evils that make it incompatible with the existence of God? How are those evils different from the others? But now notice in the case of the evidential argument from evil, most proponents, most atheists who like this argument, allow that some evils do not have this bearing on the question, does God exist? But their point is that there are evils. If not all evils, there are some evils that are such that they make it very unlikely that God exists. Sure, it's still logically possible that God exists. There's no contradiction there. It's just unreasonable. Okay? Just because three propositions are not contradictory doesn't mean it makes sense to believe that they're all true. It makes sense to believe that they all could be true, but it doesn't follow from the fact that they all could be true that it is reasonable to believe they all are true. And this is the point the evidentialist makes. He wants to say that even though all three propositions could be true without contradiction, some of the evils in the world are such that it's rather unlikely that they're all true. It's unlikely that God exists. It's unlikely either that God is morally perfect or that God is all-powerful. Now, why is that? Because of the profusion and character of some of these evils. What do we mean by the profusion of evil? What does the word profusion refer to? Amount. It concerns quantity. So there's something about the actual quantity of evil that we discover in the world that makes it less likely that God exists. The idea then seems to be that if there was just less evil in the world than we actually encounter, then it wouldn't be as unlikely that God exists. It's the fact that there's so much evil that makes it unlikely. One would think that if God was morally perfect, and if God was all-powerful, He wouldn't want to permit the amount of evil that we have in the world. Why? Because it would seem that God's purposes for permitting evil could be accomplished without permitting that much evil. You see how this argument works? It's a different kind of argument. It seems like a morally perfect, omnipotent God could accomplish His purposes, the same purposes, just as effectively without permitting so much evil. Now, another element that plays a role here is quality. Not just quantity, but quality or character. All right? So now the question is, what kinds of evils has God permitted? It's not just how much evil God allows, but what kinds of evils God allows. And some evils are especially difficult to harmonize with the alleged good purposes of an all-powerful God. William Rowe gives as his example, his famous example, a fawn, a deer. Right? It starts off as a fawn, and before it reaches maturity, it is caught in a forest fire. Okay? And because of the smoke and the fire and the heat, the fawn runs and falls and breaks a leg and can't get up to save itself. And it gradually, slowly, painfully, right, dies of suffocation in this forest fire. Now, we're not talking about the profusion of evil anymore. We're talking about the character of evil. We're talking about the quality of evil. This seems to be the sort of evil that serves no good purpose at all. I mean, what good purpose could possibly be served by God's permission of such an evil? This is the question. Now, is evil of some kind